Now, Brian King is going, who's the coordinator for CGIAR. He's going to present on operationalizing data privacy and security in global agriculture research for development.
All right, thank you. Thanks a lot, Aaron, and thanks everybody for great presentations so far. I coordinate a program called the Platform for Big Data in Agriculture of the CGIAR Consortium of Agricultural Development Research Institutes. We're somewhere between 9 and 15 centers.
Brian, are you meaning to share your screen with your PowerPoint?
I will once I start.
Oh, okay. Just want to make sure.
Okay, yeah, thanks. We're somewhere between 9 and 15 centers around the world, looking into virtually every aspect of food security research. And we have about 750,000 varieties of food crops that we preserve and regenerate and characterize around the world. And so, you know, dealing with this complexity is something that my program has kind of taken on and trying to guide this pretty diffuse global organization towards some common standards and practices regarding responsible use of data. You know, as I think about this theme, I think about, you know, probably over a decade ago, the open data kind of movement started gaining some momentum. The fair data principles came into being sometime after that, in terms of, you know, what does it mean to be, you know, making meaningful sharing of data? Are you sharing data that can be readily used and reused? And you know, the vision continues to be a really great one of the ability to reproduce research, accelerate research, spark new collaborations that could be happening that might not otherwise have happened without access to the data. And I think that, you know, this group won't be surprised when I say that I think that we've also seen a bit of a kind of circular conversation about open data in the last several years, where everybody agrees there's a great vision and everybody agrees it gets very complicated very quickly in terms of you know, ethics and privacy and so forth. And so I know, at least in the context of my own organization, that additional layer of complexity in terms of data sharing has actually, you know, been a force for kind of slowing a bit progress towards the vision. I mean, I don't think it ever stopped. It is advancing, but it's not as moving as quickly as it could. And so what we set out to do was to try to help researchers navigate this, this complexity. And you know, I think that the complexity itself has actually increased in recent years with the proliferation of devices and you know, satellite imagery becoming more fit for purpose for agriculture, you know, the sort of march of IoT and connected devices into the field. And that's actually resulted in a kind of proliferation of laws, policies, codes of conduct, ethical frameworks, and so forth. And as they intersect with storage, management, sharing of farm and farmer data, and then in the context of our organization, certainly, but many, we have to deal with global stakeholder networks, all of which are facing their own unique version of the intersection of all of these things. And so to try to get a handle on this complexity, we brought a lawyer on for several months to go through the exercise of you know, lit review and looking at the ethical frameworks, looking at the policy and regulation. I don't know that he spent 76 days reading end user licensing agreements, but actually he didn't. But and we generated a really, what I think is a really rich resource for our own researchers, built around the research data lifecycle. And you can go, there's about 130 sources, I said, some of them internal to CGIAR, some of them external. And we've even got a little kind of navigate search kind of tool there where you can poke around and see you know, what the UN had to say about anonymization, for example. So you know, we went into this. I think we've got an actionable, good set of guidelines. As we got into it, we found very similar to several comments, you know, in line with several comments today. We found that, you know, there's this tension that everybody's managing between having the really granular data that you need for certain types of analysis and anonymization and public data or open data. And great quote from UCLA Law Review about you can have either useful or perfectly anonymous data, but never both. So what this, I mean, I think this group won't be surprised of what we came up with, but we did that. We completed this mapping of the codes of conduct, ethical frameworks, policy and regulation, and so forth, and kind of map them back to the research data lifecycle. And so it's practices that won't be surprising, like at the moment of developing your research, to identify ways in which you might be using personally identifiable information or particularly sensitive information, so that you can start making a plan about how much you really need those. And if you do need them, how will you be archiving them, how you will be informing subjects, how will you manage that kind of going forward. And so it's, you know, at each step in the research data or in the research cycle, you know, to kind of look back at it, some pretty distilled good practice guidelines that will help researchers to manage data responsibly. So I think where, you know, so, you know, through the whole life cycle, at some point you'll want to decide, hopefully you'll decide early on if it's data that you're going to be holding on for a long time, at which point you need to think about storage, or if you're going to be just deleting that personally identifiable information or other sensitive data after your particular bit of research has been completed. And I think that one insight as well, and again, this will be no surprise to the group, how dynamic the field is, and how, you know, even in the context of a particular research effort, there could be some shifts that you had not anticipated. And so continually going back and examining your data plan, the underlying assumptions about the ethics of that plan, and trying to feed that into learning of individuals and of the organization. So great. I mean, we feel really good about this as guidance to our researchers, but there's a particular gap or set of gaps that we saw in terms of operationalizing this in our organization beyond just the researcher level. And that is particularly around the technological supports to the management, storage, sharing, and so forth of data, you know, that are invoked in these guidelines. And so we reached out to the University of Minnesota to help us to start to look into that in more depth. And, you know, I think the community, as I mentioned early on, has kind of noted that there's a lot of complexity to manage. And I know that this community has taken on that complexity and specifically looked for ways to be managing it more effectively. And so what the University of Minnesota team did was look at some common risk frameworks out there, looked at several different risk frameworks and kind of tiered risk models, and made a recommendation of 3 tiers of risk that would be easy to implement, easy to understand, and they could be a really good complement to those guidelines, but they could also inform some of the technology choices related to the data management, storage, sharing, and so forth. And so what they did was working with, I mean, they did a bit of their own review as well in terms of policy and regulation. They looked at the lit review and review that we went through in developing of these guidelines for our researchers, created this decision framework with the low, medium, high risk tiers, and then did the crosswalking to actual specific technology standards. And well, actually there's a GDPR there and also a regulatory requirement. And so, you know, these are standards like, I mean, we won't spin through all of these, but, you know, it's information security management standards at an organization level, information establishment of information security management systems, cloud, how do you implement those in the cloud, several things about protecting and control guidelines for sensitive information, which, and also, of course, personal identifiable information is kind of the archetypal, sensitive data. And so where we went from here was we realized that, fantastic, we still have some more steps to take in terms of operationalizing this in our organization. So one thing that we got some help from the lawyer who helped us on the guidelines to do a kind of quick review and comment on the work so far. And he noted that there could well be some particular considerations with vulnerable data subjects that we're not adequately understanding when we move into this. And so I know the authors weren't intending to imply that anonymization would sort of solve everything. But he was just sort of highlighting that when we work with vulnerable populations, we should be thinking about the various ways that those populations might be put at additional risk through our actions. And this informed consent question came up in his review, and I've heard it discussed today about, how, what am I trying to say? I think like true informed consent might be really difficult to achieve with anybody, and might be difficult to achieve with, smallholder farmers that are very culturally and economically kind of separate and isolated from where this technology is coming from. And so one great example that I've come across myself is there's a great paper that looks at mapping wealth and poverty using cell phone network metadata, and the researchers went through, got informed consent, did great process and practice as far as I could tell. One thing jumped out at me in that paper was that they hadn't set out to learn, but they developed the capability to predict if somebody had acquired a motorcycle or use of a motorcycle just by their movement patterns. And so, if I had been involved in that study, would I have been able to think, if I'm talking with a smallholder farmer somewhere, say, okay, we'd like to make use of your mobile phone number, we'd like to be able to predict things about wealth and poverty. Are you okay with that? Great, we'll use it. A true full informed consent might have been, someday I'm going to know if you have a motorcycle. So it's this dynamic, evolving environment where true informed consent actually presents some challenges. And so we have some ideas. We can talk a little bit about how we might be able to manage that a bit better. Now, I think just the work of crosswalking standards, codes of conduct and policy and regulation and so forth with technical standards is a great first step. Now we need to tease out kind of who owns what next steps at our centers in terms of putting those things into practice. So between the legal department, the IT managers, the researchers themselves, the research managers, and so forth. And then lastly, I think we could take some more steps in making it easier for researchers to follow the guidelines, to observe these steps, to go through good practice. And so we can fine tune some electronic versions of data management plans that help researchers in a kind of low friction way develop data management plans. And that gives us an opportunity to pull out different sensitive types of data and pose the questions that need to be asked about what is going to happen with that data. And so certainly personal identifiable information, genetic resources that came up in the discussion during the last presentation is something else we think a lot about. These 750,000 some crops, I think a majority of them are land races that would not exist if it weren't for indigenous communities around the world. And there are obligations under the Global Convention for Biodiversity and some other treaties and national policy and regulation where we have a stewardship role. And so data related to those genetic resources is something we need to be keeping an eye on. And so by sensitive data type, obviously sensitivities vary by context and actor. And then, you know, we need to arrive at something that makes it reasonably easy to act and behave responsibly. And so I really appreciate the chance to engage with this community and some wider communities around how we learn better to do that. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. David, do we have any questions?
One that was actually sent to everybody. What sorts of data analysis is performed, storage and analysis? And then the second question, can user implement his or her own analysis via customization?
So, I mean, we're doing, this is, I mean, we as I said in the outset, we do research into virtually every aspect of food security research. And so there's research from the, you know, trait identification, crop improvement and breeding programs, on-farm, more agronomic research, the climatic and socioeconomic context of farming and food security. And so the analyses are sort of all of that. It's a bit balkanized because we're multiple centers with multiple research programs and so forth. And so in terms of what we support, we're kind of most equipped right now to help support some different types of geospatial analysis and then help support with the discovery of the data that's being put into open data repositories. And then in terms of development of specific pipelines and so forth, I think that there's a gap, particularly on the technology solutions for data sharing that enable kind of more use case specific analyses. I hope that helps.
Okay, and what are some of the largest challenges you face with data privacy over geopolitical boundaries? And are some of these so large that you cannot address them in a general way?
I think the not addressing them in a general way is the crux of it. Just the regulatory layer itself, as a few speakers have mentioned, requires different behavior by different national environment. And then when you layer that with ethical considerations, when you layer that with types of risk that might exist in any research environment, there's a lot of complexity and a lot of site specificity. And so this, you know, what we're striving to do is provide enough of a decision framework that can guide people towards good practice and good decisions across an array of contexts. We haven't yet encountered situations like, well, we're starting to encounter regulatory requirements where the data needs to be stored in a, you know, physically in a national territory. But you know, we'll see that more and more. We're of course encountering situations where a data holder wants it to be on their premise or under their real direct control, but still has an interest in collaborating. And so I think that there's, in addition to data use agreements, I think that we could work out some very use case specific ways of enabling those analyses. And we've heard of some of those kinds of solutions so far.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. Could you elaborate at all on the ethical and governance implications of genomic data collection and use? How does CGIAR frameworks interact with the Convention on Biological Diversity Protocols?
Mm-hmm. There's well, maybe it's inaccurate to say, I consider it a kind of subsidiary treaty to the Global Convention on Biodiversity, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. And that specifically looks at the genetic resources that are in the name, but you know, it establishes this kind of precept that the benefits should accrue from use of those genetic resources to essentially the point of origin of those those genetic resources. And so I'm probably misstating it because I'm not a lawyer, but, and so what that means in practice then is that the global treaties establish a kind of access and benefit sharing regime that's the benefits are supposed to accrue back to where those resources come from. Now that whole genomes are increasingly available for analysis, there's a lot of debate about how do you best apply that principle to the data, to the genomic data itself. And so it's an emergent area, but I mean, the overarching principle of access and benefit sharing is established, and it's part of what we act on because we see ourselves as stewards of that data. And then exactly how does that translate into how genomic sequence information is used most responsibly, directly impacts what decisions you make about data management. Anyway, it's kind of an emerging area still, but I think the overall obligations are established. Now we need to figure out the systems and the data management that help us fulfill that.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Thank you for taking the time to present. I appreciate it very much.